This view should be imprinted in all of us. It's been shown time and time again. It shows what happens when a different virus enters into our pig populations and then spreads rapidly through those populations. Let's not forget that. Importantly, as we look back, the question is, was it a surprise? The answer is no. There was anecdotal reports from the regions. There was public papers from researchers noting the increased activity in other areas of the world. There was researcher-to-researcher communications, again, saying, be aware, there's increased activity. There was reports to our PEDv Swine Health Committee, again, from practitioners, veterinarians, researchers in Asia saying this virus is a risk to your industry. The question is, what did we do with that information? What do we need to change moving forward? We recognize today that it exposed a major lapse in our bioexclusion. And I would say and argue that we know very, very little about pathogen exclusion, at least geographically around the world, and how it applies to our industry. I would also say at the same time, everyone in this room is tremendous at understanding bioexclusion of the viruses and bacteria that we deal with on a daily basis. We didn't recognize the input sources, and we really don't recognize those yet today. When we looked at the system, the Carthage system, we recognized that we had 38 different products that were coming in from areas that would be in the high-risk category for PED. When we ask ourselves, what did we know about those sources? What do we know about the manufacturing processes? The answer is we didn't know anything about those. We also recognized that many of those inputs changed over time without our understanding of a switch in sources. I would challenge us today, we still don't know. We don't know what those risks are. We don't know what the manufacturing processes are. We don't know about the viability of different viruses in transport, and really what are the true risks that it presents to our national swine herd. We've outsourced many of those inputs because of cost. I think it's time to go back and look and do a complete cost review and say, what really is that worth to us and what really is that costing us? We realize there's a lot of barriers. One is cost. One is I'm continually told that to develop manufacturing plants in the U.S. would have tremendous restrictions because of EPA requirements. We still need to go back and look at that. We need to understand what is the cost savings versus the risk benefit. The next two slides are a calendar presented by Dr. Harry Snelson. I wanted to use this to remind ourselves that we were throwing a case of a virus that had very unique clinical signs in all stages of our population. The question is, did we find the index case? Because if we did not find the index case when we have a virus that clinically is very active, we have no chance against many of the other viruses and bacteria that might challenge our populations. So when it was identified and reported as the first 4 cases on the 17th of April, and in actuality, we had 31 cases looking back in retrospect. The thing I would ask us to rethink there is, again, it's a pathogen that gave very distinct clinical signs. We all recognize why we did not identify those first cases. We have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do differently as we move forward? We focused, and we'll continue to focus on FADs because of their cost, and as Peter reminded us, as we move to a country that is relying heavily on exports, this would devastate our industries we know it today. Again, I would challenge us and say, because of the pig movement that we have in the U.S., because of the flows that we have, the unknowns we have on inputs, these risks are real, and our ability to secure that production is going to be very, very challenging. You're probably like me. We didn't know what a transboundary disease was. I thought it's when I crossed the Mississippi River from Illinois to Iowa. That normally gets me in trouble. And I realize today that's true. It's a non-reportable, it's non-regulatory, it's designed for production diseases like PRRS, PCV2, PED, Delta coronavirus. It's really a way to allow production to continue to move rather than putting it in to a category of an FAD. We've got to look back and say, how do we want to respond moving forward to a transboundary disease? Well, where are we at today? Many, many good outcomes have occurred because of the introduction of these swine enteric viruses. It stimulated us in numerous avenues. It strengthened our industry. It's going to be a turning point as we move forward for both you and I and our producers. Peter mentioned that we have to open up on our privacy. We've gained small steps. We're going to have to gain many larger steps. Our industry committed a tremendous amount of funds very quickly and used a different, more active strategy to try to identify research priority and feedback information to you and I in the field and to our producers. 2013, they funded $1 million in research. 2014, $2 million. You can see the number of projects. The difference was requiring very, very rapid turnaround time so that information could drive changes for producers. We learned that if you can't grow the virus, we've got a lot of challenges. We learned that bioassays are limited in availability, time, expense, and sample size. I would argue that that's one of our biggest weaknesses as we approach this problem early on. We failed to recognize what the pigs were telling us. Sick pigs, go look at where the virus may have come from, and then make decisions to provide further bioexclusion. We've seen published from University of Minnesota and Peter Davies, what are the weaknesses of bioassay based on sample size? And if we're going to use that information to make decisions in the field, we've got to be very critical, because that clearly directed us in other areas week after week, month after month. Because we can't grow the virus yet today, we continue to spend dollars and dollars on PCRs. All of us in this room have looked at environmental sampling, using that to drive more intense sanitation, more intense cleanliness. That's a huge cost to our people in the barns, because we really don't know what the environmental sampling does other than to give us benchmarks. Clearly, our inability to grow the virus limited our epidemiological investigations, and they clearly contributed to the discussions and the controversy around where did that virus enter and how did that virus move between wide geographical areas. We've learned a lot about the survivability of the virus. One of the things you have to ask yourself is, if this virus has been present for years around the world, why isn't more information available? The bottom line is the U.S. industry, our researchers, and you lead the way with respect to good studies, good data, and then good interpretation of that data and application. It's fecal oral, so the things that we recognize then about that transmission is true with this virus. We've got some guidelines with respect now to the survivability in slurry, manure, water, environmental conditions, pits, things that you and I deal with on a daily basis. I put an X in this slide because we've all reported that we learned a lot about transportation. I would argue, no, that's basic 101. You have a fecal-oral route of transmission of a virus or a bacteria such as Brachiospira. Transportation is going to be an issue. Cross-contamination at our collection points are going to be an issue. Cross-contamination at our coal-sow buying stations are going to be an issue. What we've learned is we've got to be more proactive. This was setting out in front of us. It was not this virus alone that we should have been looking at these key methods of cross-contamination. We've had a laxity in truck washes, but that's only because we haven't done a good job of putting a value on those truck washes to our clients. Many of us have done calculations to determine how many truck washes we need, how many trucks we need. The way our industry is structured today, we can't hit some of the goals that we want. If you and I believe it's 100% requirement for all transportation vehicles to be properly washed, disinfected, or dried. What that means is we've got to use our calculations to say, let's set up a priority. We know what's important in terms of that hierarchy in transportation and work from the highest to the lowest. We did a study at slaughter plants. Matthew Turner grabbed samples from coal-sow buying stations. That helped drive us and say, what happens, what's the contamination rate of a clean trailer after a dirty trailer enters the slaughter plant? We're starting the next study now to look at what changes can a plant actually make that'll further drive those decisions. Many of the suggestions that we put forth for plants and buying stations, I'm embarrassed to say were impractical. They were being made by ones of us that don't work every day at those situations, don't work in the plants, don't understand the throughputs of plants. Hopefully the study will go back and then allow plants to start putting some cost benefit on those and the industry to start putting some cost benefit. We know how to inactivate the virus. The good thing is we continue to move toward more and more practical solutions. This week you saw I just released a study from the Iowa State group, Daryl's group, looking at disinfectant, including propylene glycol, when temperatures such as what we've seen in the Midwest the last few days occur. Again, how are we going to get to the end game? We're starting to, or continue to get practical research. We certainly learned back at the barns, but I would tell you that if we go back and we look at other pathogens such as rotavirus C, rotavirus B, Clostridium, we need to go back and say, what do we know about proper sanitation and cleanliness that'll lower the concentration levels within our farrowing barns? I just recently reviewed some papers from on the dairy side looking at the efforts that they go through to reduce bacterial counts in facilities. There's some application to us here in terms of the steps that are actually necessary to accomplish our end goal. We've learned a lot about immunity. I would say that we need to learn a lot more. We know that sows respond to natural plant exposure. I'm making an effort to change my wording from feedback to natural plant exposure for a number of reasons. We know that sows develop antibodies. If you go back to our experience with TGE, we thought PED would respond like TGE. It doesn't respond similarly to TGE in all aspects. The virus lingers longer in the environment. The immunity tends to be lower in gilts and Parity 1 sows. Tends to contribute to the endemic nature. We know that vaccines help based on our mortality studies and some shedding studies. But we also need a next generation of vaccines. Immunity and the length of that immunity is really what's holding us back in terms of moving forward with elimination of the virus out of our pig populations. That immunity is of short duration. We're now entering year 2 where we know that when re-exposure occurs, either from within herd or outside a herd, we generally do not have complete immunity. We recognize that Parity 1 immunity is a weak link. Many of us have done or participated in antibody studies, trying to understand first, what is a protective antibody? What is the difference between a herd that is, quote, endemic or slow to clear the virus versus one that is very rapidly clearing the virus? I would say today, I certainly do not understand that. I could put forth data that shows parallel herds, looks like parallel levels of antibody across many different assays of antibodies. One herd clearing the virus in 8 weeks, one herd now going on 52 weeks. Comparing environmental samples, excellent environmental reduction of the virus within the farm, yet we still have relapses of circulation. You should have seen recently a study published where there is some cross-reaction between the Indel strain and the original strain. I believe that's very, very weak cross-protection. Our experience is that, again, when we match up herds, we have herds that clear the virus very, very quickly, and all of those strains. And then when we have multiple strains enter the herds, we still have clinical outbreaks. We still have pre-winter mortality, again, when we match them up, that appears to be very similar. So I have a question in my mind about how solid that cross-protection really is. In this particular slide, I want you to look on the right. This looks at an endemic herd and with pre-winter mortality broken down by parity. The blue line is the pre-winter mortality in the Parity 1 litters compared to the remaining parity sows within that population. Notice that it reached almost 70% pre-winter mortality in the Parity 1s, and during the high outbreak had very normal pre-winter mortality in the P2s and above. If we look on the slide on the left, notice the pre-winter mortality by day it would look very similar to an original episode in that particular herd. A key unknown is, what can we do to change the immunity of the Parity 1? That's not unique. If you go back and you look at Dr. Linda Safe's work on rotavirus throughout her career, there's always a difference in Parity 1 immunity compared to the older Parity sows. The question again is, how do we change that? And if you're an endemic herd, does that mean we've got to remove all the Parity 1 pigs for a short period of time in order to eliminate the virus out of the herd? It would look like that's a potentially good strategy. We learned a lot about feed ingredients, feed system. I would again say what we learned is we don't know very much about sources of ingredients, safety of ingredients, survivability of the virus, not only of PED, but other viruses. It may or may not be a risk. There's obviously transport time from manufacture to when it gets to our farms, but we don't understand that risk. A major breakthrough with the work that showed Salcurb and other formaldehyde-based medium-chain fatty acids have an effect on inactivating the virus. That's a strategy that can be used with some of our new feed mills and plants. It's a strategy that's problematic for many of the old mills. It does open up a question and an area of research to say, is that where, if we don't know about the risk of the incoming ingredients, we can't control those, should we put our efforts at the outgoing end of the chain and try to continue to look for methods of inactivation, not only of this virus, but other viruses, to protect the farms? You've seen the work from K-State and others looking at pelleting. Looks like that is a help, but there's still a window of time and temperature that's necessary to inactivate the virus, and that window is very, very hard to achieve and also hard to measure. If we look more specifically about some of the ingredients of concern, so porcine products, the process itself would say that would inactivate the virus. It has some of the same challenges that we have with understanding the security of pelleting, and that is, how do I measure inside the process? And is the process 100%, or is there lapses in that process through nobody's fault that represents a risk to our populations? It has driven changes. If you look at the storage now of porcine plasma, that storage and that temperature looks to secure that supply before it goes to the pigs. I would also go back and say that using that information early on is important in how we make decisions at the pig level. Biological companies responded very quickly. I think it reemphasizes that given the value of the losses and then the value of the intervention, we do respond. I mentioned earlier we need to continue to look for the second generation. We learned that we need a robust epidemiological model. We need to realize and look within ourselves that we have to contribute the time and effort to do that. If you look at the original questionnaires that were sent out by PAASV, we had good early response. That response tailed off very quickly. We learned that if those questions are not open-ended, it's very, very difficult to get the direction that we need or you need to make decisions and to do further investigations. If you're like me, you want to go down a path of a checklist because of time and speed and effort. Yet, what I've learned is that's like looking at all biosecurity. It's the open-ended questions that are the most important. We're going to have to back up and say, how do we get that done? We have to decide moving forward if we can use a standardized type of questionnaire and then have modules that would be able to be put in given the pathogen of interest that would also then have questions that would wrap more specifically around that individual pathogen and what those risks are. Epidemiological investigations take time and effort. As a member of the committee, we do have a rapid response team. I would tell you that generally we weren't very rapid. And also generally we ran into barriers because of lack of permission to interview, lack of permission to actually get to the farms in a way that was necessary. And then frequently, because of all the activity that was going on, the herds themselves were tied up with control, containment, saving pigs. So it was a unique situation where an epidemiological investigation is highly critical to our success. There was a number of normal barriers to slow down that process. I think we learned that the stakeholders can cooperate. Again, Peter mentioned we're going to have to open up on privacy. It's a struggle that our clients have and we have every day with respect to how does the information get spread around and how do we use that information to identify risk and make decisions. We're gaining. I would tell you we've got to do a lot more. It's a challenge for someone at my stage because for years we've been the other way, saying that the information belongs to the producer. They're going to make the right decision. We've got to recognize, though, the movement of pigs, the globalization of our industry, and we are in a different business today. We're going to have to lead our producers and our companies to open up. We're going to have to figure out what the barriers are to get them to open up and to continue to share that information. We've got to be very happy about the cooperation of the people in this group. We shared information. I would say that sometimes it wasn't good information, and it was probably many times misleading information, but there was a sharing, trying to understand how to control, particularly how to contain, and then how to exclude the viruses out of the populations. We certainly move forward with premise IDs. Nothing like mandatory requirements to help the system. Even though on one of our recent conference calls was brought to our attention that herds that are negative, we're doing a very poor job of completing the answering of those questions so they truly get back on the negative list so that when if they turn positive again, we'll have a true positive prevalence rate. I think we got to look at we know there's some weaknesses yet in the premise IDs. Some systems, large systems may only have one premise ID, and so it doesn't represent the number of animals or the herds or the facilities necessarily. We got to take a look at that again and clarify that a little bit tighter. We learned there's a tremendous need for education. I would say that our National Pork Board group committees that many of you participated on did a tremendous job of formulating worksheets, practical, based on what we knew at that time and what you thought could be accomplished. I would challenge us, we need to do more. Again, many of those didn't take into some of the things that are barriers for the people that we asked to implement those procedures. So for you and me that are in the field every day, that's what our value is. What can we really do at the manure applicator level? What can we really do at the barn door level? What can we do at the lairage or the slaughterhouse level that will really move the needle? I think we recognized on the education side that there's worldwide information, but yet does not have the quality and robustness that we need here in the U.S. I would also say that what it taught me is that our veterinary education today may be outdated looking at our industry moving forward. Maybe it's more important to understand how to do correct epidemiological investigations. Maybe it's more important to ask, where's the ingredients come from? What's the risk of those ingredients? We pay lip service, but it's time to move forward. For any of you that don't recognize this, this is a young Doug McDougall. The Canadians had a different situation. They were able to learn from what you did every day. They were able to leverage off of our research. They were very concerned because, as you know, pigs enter from the U.S. every week. They're finished in the Midwest. They had a high risk of transport contamination back to Canada. Yet they moved more concisely than what we did. So you have to ask yourself, why was that? And what should we do differently? I would tell you that a big difference is they flooded those cases with veterinarians. They had veterinarians in the barns very quickly. They were able to connect the dots, partially because of luck, because the early cases were clustered coming out of a limited number of feed mills. I would also tell you they didn't really let some of the science get in the way. That science being, one, we can't grow the virus. Two, those feed ingredients were not at risk based on many of the consultants' advice. They said, but the pigs are telling us this is what happened. I can make decisions. We've got to look and say, how do we take that lesson? I think we recognize we didn't have the ideal model in place. And I would argue we still don't have the model in place. There's been a number of articles recently, one from the January 15th JABNA, not applying directly to pigs, but I think tells you what our challenges are. We have an opportunity to develop and activate and sustain a model for emerging diseases. Research teams have discovered more than 800 novel viruses in the past 5 years. There's a number of agencies that are funding looking into those viruses. Some of those will apply to pigs. Linking the efforts with the guidelines after swine enteric coronaviruses needed to investigate novel viruses will suggest that we will increase dramatically as technology lunges forward. Many of you are aware of the technology of identifying viruses that our diagnostic capabilities will have. The question will be, how do we interpret that information back at the barn level? One of the things that was put out in the publications when the federal order went into effect was, if you looked at the fine print, we're going to follow up every coronavirus. That makes people like me just a little bit nervous. It needs to be associated with what is clinical disease and what's the risk to the industry. Well, it's more than what I had on the previous slide. This was also an article, a study published by Anthony in 2013. estimated a minimum of 320,000 mammalian viruses awaiting to discovery within only 9 families. Let's think about the model. There's really 3 things that we need to think about. One is, little guy on the left is thinking pretty hard. This virus was new. We knew it was present around the world. We didn't have the right model. We didn't act. The one in the center, we're too slow. We're still too slow. The speed of what we have to make decisions, you have to make decisions in these situations, is unbelievable. And it's driven by how fast we move pigs. Earlier I showed the difference between the index case and really the cases that were there in retrospective. To think it's going to be any different in the future, given our production system, I would say, is a miss. On the right, our charter is to educate our members. We've got to back and say this means global education. We do have some models we can look at. You're all familiar and should be abreast at the secure pork supply. This represents a model that can also work for an emerging disease. If you look through there, you've got the various stakeholders. You've got a flow of information. You've got laboratories that are up and ready to run diagnostic testing. You've got an information flow system through EMERS. You've got state health stakeholders and throughout the loop. When you look at the objectives, improving prevention, early detection, rapid diagnosis, containment, mitigation, recovery, all good, right? The question again is, early identification, or do we put our time on bio-exclusion rather than containment? Another model we can look at is the Canadian model. I've got that on the slide here. If you look at the Swine Health Intelligence Network, that has some attributes that are a little stronger than where we sit today. As I think about when we go forward, we need to think about what is the right model of investigation, or chaos will occur. As I look back, we didn't put enough effort into these early cases. And I would also say we're not putting enough effort right now in the few percentage of cases that are reoccurring from a year ago. If you look at what Shimp put out a couple weeks ago, previously infected herds have about twice the prevalence rate right now as new herds in terms of PED. So the question rises, is that a lateral exposure? So we missed it? Is it within herd shedding again? Or is there environmental contamination that we thought we had eliminated out of the facilities? Always more questions. PEDv is broken down through different committees in terms of what's the resource category. So on this slide, the next slide, I have that listed. The message for us here is it's going to take a lot of our resources. We're going to have to figure out how to put the time, the effort, and get funded to shift those resources. But if you think through in terms of diagnostics, you can see there's a list. You think through in terms of epidemiology, there's a list. Routes of transmission. Viral viability. We've made great progress with the coronaviruses in terms of what disinfectants, what drying time. We'll continue to fine-tune that so we make it more practical. I mentioned that there's still questions on immunity. It's likely that what we learn with PED will extend to some of the other coronaviruses, hopefully. It's also likely that what we're learning in terms of sanitation will help us segregate the Parity 1 differently than what we do today within farrowing rooms. It opens up the question about, should we design facilities differently than what you and I have done? If any of you have tried to put all the Parity 1s and a PED herd in the same room, an endemic herd, if your experience is like ours, all the pigs die. So segregation alone within the same farrowing facility doesn't seem to be a strategy that we can use moving forward. And clearly we need resources on global distribution. Now, that probably sounds very daunting, but in actuality, there's not that many viruses yet of concern. PAASV had a committee, has a health committee, had a special committee of which I was a member. I think, John, you were on that committee. We were given the task to look at what are the high-risk viruses that potentially could enter the U.S. And really, when you narrow it down, I'm not sure now without counting again how many's on that slide, but we started out with something like 50 and said, no, for a number of reasons, this particular virus is really low risk, not likely to happen. Now, the background behind that is you hope you have the right people with the right knowledge helping to give input in that matrix. And you can see over at the right, the committee had a score in this column, and then the Swine Health Committee had a rank, and the National Board also had a rank. Again, trying to say, how do we prioritize our resources and what's our next risk? Not surprising, the FADs are going to make the top of that list. Peter mentioned the movement in Europe of African swine fever. We got to be aware that even though many of us in here were involved with pseudorabies eradication in China or Asia, there's a strain now that is not protected by the common vaccines, and it's highly aggressive within those herds. So it becomes, because of its survivability, one that has to be on the list and one of concern. As we move forward, I would tell us that we need a broad discipline team of experts. We're going to have to figure out how to fund those experts because they're somewhat on two different resource bases. One is to look every quarter or every 6 months about changes around the world because that ranking could change. We need to have people looking at that and saying, is the ranking changed? If so, why is it changed? And where does it move up our list? The second function would be we need these experts to do investigations as soon as a new pathogen enters the production. And I got more of that on the next slides. It's important as we look back to say that encompasses many disciplines and many experts. One of the mistakes we made early on was not getting all of those disciplines, all those experts in the barns at the same time. We did it by phone. We did it by going down the end of a dead-end path and then looking another path. That's inefficient. It's costly. It doesn't stop the move of the virus. I would also get us all to remember that PCV2 moved throughout the U.S. industry in 6 months. We asked the same questions, but why did we put it underneath the rug? Because we had vaccines come out that were highly effective. We were lucky. You still got to ask the same questions. How does a virus move throughout the U.S. pig industry in less than 6 months? That committee's got to be working in concert with each other under a coordinator, because there's got to be continual updates. If any of you have ever had a chance to work with some of these emergency facilitators in your local communities, those people are adept at staying calm, making decisions, redirecting effort. We have those within our profession. We need to use them. The decision-making group has to be advising the USDA, so that's what the Swine Health Information Committee hopefully will do. That's stronger in Canada than what it is today. Whether we can get that done as an industry, I think, remains to be seen. I would say it's critical. We clearly need the coordinator of information and the strategy. We need an outbreak investigator facilitator. We need literature reviewers. I don't know, Matthew, if you're like me, I just kind of read the summary most of the time, and if it looks in favor of my bias, I go with it. What I learned is that that's inefficient for you and me to do that at the start of a disease outbreak. We've got PhD students trying to work their way through veterinary school, animal science. They're skilled. And if you remember that survey or that summary that came out from K-State on the feed side, that was a tremendous summary. Problem is, it would have been nice about 6 months before that, right? But it's going to take effort and direction and funding to get that done. You and I got to be out in the barns. They should be telling us, you got to look down this hole. This is what the literature says. This is the hole you got to look down. We go look in the hole. The hole is full. You go look at another hole. Within 48 hours, 72 hours, we would have direction about where to go look. We need a science-based study coordinator. I would applaud us all in this room of all the practical research and the fast research that was done. I've mentioned on at least 2 different times what National Pork Board did, but yet many of you in this room did research. Now, what I would challenge us is that a lot of that was poor research or poor studies. It just confused the situation, because we might go out and do 10 swabs and say, this is what happened in this herd. When you look back, you see a variety and a normal distribution across the number of herds. How fast the virus cleared, how fast it didn't clear. Now, how do we overcome that? Because we want that effort? Well, we need somebody to tell us. If you're going to go do sampling, you take this many samples, you do them here, and across the number of us, we have a systematic way to do that. And we have someone grouping that information back and then pulling it out. I think individually in this room, either yourself or your companies spent a lot of money on PCRs again, looking at different down tracks, holes. That's inefficient and it's costly and didn't really get us to the point where we want to get us to. Applaud the effort, but we need a better direction. We certainly have producers. We got diagnosticians. The committees have looked and said, again, there's a whole chain of events that have to happen. So we can say we need to analyze or surveil for a different virus. Are the primers in order, and are we doing that on a regular basis? I would say we need toxicologists, because remember, it's not all disease. In fact, on that very first case, it didn't really look like it could be PED on one of those first cases. It didn't look like, because when you wean the pigs, they got better. And those are almost in mental conflict with each other. You got a very active virus. You take the pigs off the sows, and they got a lot better. Pointing, at least early on, that maybe it's a toxin and not an enteric virus. It would be a suspect. Clearly, we got to have input side nutritionists. And again, I would emphasize we need veterinarians in the barn. We have to look at our own work schedules, whether we're within companies or out of companies, and say, how can I get my resources allocated to that? Because in this particular case, and I think in many others, it consumes all your resources the first day. Talking with management, talking with your producer, talking with your clients. You don't have time to focus on an epidemiological investigation because particularly as we got into it, we understood how to wean down pigs and how to move pigs and how to increase the survivability. Those were all actions that need to happen within 24 hours to improve the success. So it diverts our attention. But we have a lot of resources. I don't know if Steve Henry's in here. As some of these veterinarians get more mature and are looking for opportunities, I would say that we've got a tremendous resource to call on. We got to have a standardized format. We're clearly pushing toward using PADRAP as that base. There's been some funding for that. I mentioned earlier, I think the goal is to use that for all the background information, but to have a pull and plug so that if there's a pathogen that comes in identified, because we get tired of doing repeating, herds, premise, all of that. You should be able to just very quickly go down through that, focus the attention. We're going to have to open up the privatize if we're going to allow surveillance testing. And then identification of where those positive negatives are. In the secure pork, we have an information flow through EMERS. We have an information flow now today for enteric coronavirus through EMERS. Is it efficient? Needs a little work yet. A lot of you are frustrated when you look. It's very hard to correlate what really happened that week because of the delay. Now, the other flip side of that is they actually validate the premise and the information, and so at the end of the day, it's more accurate than what we were doing before. Frustrating to you and I because, again, the speed of that bullet train, if you're on the track, is not a very good feeling. We've got to open up and say, where are we going to get our funding? I mentioned the rapid response team. Right now, it's all voluntary, essentially. You got some funding from the USDA that handles some of that, but you still got to be able to pull people out, skilled people, drop what they're doing, and go look. I mentioned and I listed out a number of disciplines. I'm sure there's more. They're just ones that come to my mind. I think as an industry, we got to look at a population buyout because one of the weaknesses we haven't addressed is that the difference between an FAD and a transboundary is stop movement of pigs. When you stop moving of pigs in today's flow, number one, you got a lot of resistance. Number two, it's impossible to do in a short time. And as soon as you miss the index case, it now becomes too late. The virus has moved. So we're going to have to open up and say, what's a better way to immediately be able to go in and make decisions? And we'll make wrong decisions, just like we do every day. Some herds will be taken out that don't deserve to be taken out, but we have a model on the poultry side that maybe we can look at. Okay, as we wrap this up, we've got to look at how do we distribute the financial resources during the early collection of samples and field investigation. I'm sure everyone in this room got asked to go out and get samples. I would say that for just a few dollars, you'd be more than happy to be rewarded to do that. Because we're also diverting our attention. Time and time again, I'm sure you got requests, particularly as this thing was developing. Okay, I want that virus. I want that. No, there needs to be some funding mechanism because it's time taken away for the good of the industry, but you still got to think about your individual client and about yourself. We got to minimize scientifically weak studies, reduce the duplication. I talked about that a minute ago within our own studies and our pilot studies. We got to think about efficiency. We got to accelerate the outcome of the information to drive momentum. I think as an industry and university, we also got to look at our research model. The funding that we're used to today with NIH, and maybe Dr. Lowe will talk about that, doesn't provide for some of the quick funding needs, but in the long-term funding needs that we need to answer some of these questions. Again, there are models we can look at. I happen to put on here the Australian model, and you can see the stakeholders at the bottom of that slide that contribute to their long-term funding. That's been a model that's allowed them to step out in certain areas of research and be a world leader. Time for us to take a look at our funding and say, are we a restrictor? Are we an expansion contributor? Okay, what about some cautions? Well, as I mentioned, we're going to get a lot of diagnostic capabilities. A lot of them will be good. At the same time, we're going to have to figure out how do we interpret what's it really mean at the pig level, what categories that virus or bacteria in, what decision do we need to be made very quickly. I don't think we want every agent reportable. If you look at some of these microassays now, they tell me what they're checking up to 80 viruses at a time. We've got to address biocontainment. We've got to address pig movement. We're an industry, as we know, that moves pigs every day, many different locations. I think our membership, AASV, has got to ask, do we want these new responsibilities? That's a responsibility to lead, maybe a responsibility to help be the containment of the information as a third party. But it does come with additional responsibilities. There's clearly new responsibilities on education of veterinarians. Even people like myself can learn once in a while, but only if it's repeated. I tell our group, you know, you got to repeat it 7 times in order to make a change. So I tell them, just keep talking to me. Then the last one, if you put it up on a card, that really helps. Joe, I usually get that one. For the stakeholders, there's new responsibilities. Stakeholders being every one that's listed on there. We got to remember, we're a global industry. If we're going to continue to take advantage of that and survive, we do have to do things different. And then in closing, here's the NPPC forum resolution. Coordinated strategies of governmental and industrial organizations to respond to and contain identified disease. And in the event containment would not be successful, strategies to manage the existence of a given disease. I would say that we're very good at the last part. I would say we got to keep moving forward. Then in closing, I'd like to say, my concern is, what are we going to do with this enteric virus? For 2 years, I think we have consensus we're not going to eliminate it this year. So that means we got to eliminate it in 2016, right? We clearly know how to do it. If you look at the weekly break prevalence, it's below the epidemic curve break. Where's my concern? Well, we don't understand the risk of ongoing exposure to development gilts. If we get into a plateau where we believe that's an ongoing strategy after this next year, we get complacent, then I believe that represents a risk of us eliminating the virus out of the industry. I often get asked, when you think about elimination, well, you don't know how it entered the industry. So I'm not going to spend any money eliminating that. I think all of us in this room know that the money to eliminate it on an individual herd basis is minimal to nil. And then I always fall back on, no. As an industry, we are frustrated about how it entered, but it was probably a sequence of events that occurred. And so they didn't occur the year before, in 2012, so they may not be any more likely to occur in 2016. and then that we certainly will have the knowledge of how to eliminate it, so it'll be easier to do the next time. We know our changes are like herding a group of cats. Different directions. Not all cats stay within the picture, but we don't need all cats, I think, in the picture. I would just close and say, let's learn from the enteric viruses. Let's open up our eyes. Let's think about what model is going to be in the future for us to protect our industry. I do have the opportunity to compare costs around the world frequently. This industry is the most cost competitive. That's why we have to continue to bio-exclude diseases. We've got to eliminate diseases that are within our pig populations. Thank you.